I didn't know the man whose blood mixed with mine would rewrite my life before sunrise. The rain came down in sheets, loud against my helmet, blurring every streetlight into streaks of gold and red as I tightened my grip on the handlebars of my old scooter, the delivery bag strapped behind me swaying with every turn, my phone buzzing with another late-night order I couldn't afford to ignore because rent was due in 4 days and my mom's medical bills didn't care that I was tired, that my hands were numb, that my whole body felt like it was running on fumes and cheap coffee. I remember thinking if I could just finish this last delivery, just one more mile, just one more stop, I could go home and sleep for a few hours before doing it all again. But the night had other plans, because that's when I saw him, half hidden in the shadow of an alley between a closed laundromat and a liquor store, a shape that didn't belong. Too still, too wrong. And I almost kept going. I should have kept going. People in my world didn't stop for trouble. We passed it. We survived it. We pretended we didn't see it. But something pulled at me, something quiet and stubborn that refused to let me ride away. So I slowed, heart beating faster, the rain soaking through my jacket as I stepped off the scooter and took a few careful steps closer. And then I saw his face, pale under the flickering streetlight, his breathing shallow, his hand pressed weakly against his side like he was trying to hold himself together without making a sound. And for a second I froze, because this wasn't just someone who needed help. This was something bigger, something dangerous. I could feel it in the air, the kind of silence that hums right before a storm, and I whispered, "Hey, can you hear me?" But he didn't answer, his eyes barely open, unfocused, like he was already slipping somewhere I couldn't follow, and my chest tightened because leaving him there would mean something I wasn't ready to carry. So I reached for my phone with shaking fingers and called 911, my voice low, giving the address, trying not to think about who he was or why he was here or what might happen if I got involved. Because right then he was just a stranger who needed help, and I wasn't the kind of person who walked away from that. Even if I knew better, even if every instinct told me this night was about to change everything. The ambulance lights cut through the rain 10 minutes later, red and white flashing against wet pavement, and everything moved fast after that. Questions I couldn't answer, hands guiding me aside, then pulling me back in when someone said they needed information, needed a witness, needed anything. And somehow I ended up at the hospital, sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, my clothes damp, my hands still trembling, watching doctors move behind glass as they worked to keep him alive. I should have left then. I should have walked out and gone back to my deliveries, back to my small, ordinary life. But I didn't. I stayed, because something about the way he had looked at me for that split second, like he saw me even through the pain, like he knew I was there, it wouldn't let me go. And then a doctor rushed out, voice urgent, saying they needed blood, a rare type, not enough on hand, asking if anyone could help. And before I could think, before I could stop myself, I said, "I'm O negative." The words leaving my mouth like they belonged to someone braver than me, someone who didn't hesitate, and the doctor looked at me like I had just handed him a miracle, and suddenly I was signing forms, rolling up my sleeve, lying back in a chair as the needle went in and the steady pull-off. Something warm and vital left my body, my heartbeat loud in my ears, my thoughts racing with questions I didn't have answers to, because I didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know that the man behind that hospital door was someone the entire city feared. All I knew was that I had made a choice. And as I watched the dark red line fill the bag beside me, I felt something shift, something quiet but irreversible, like I had just stepped across a line I couldn't see, and somewhere down that hallway, a machine beeped once, then again, steady now, stronger, and I didn't realize it yet. But that sound was the moment everything began. The first thing I felt was the cold, like something had been quietly taken from me and left a hollow space behind, my fingers still tingling as I sat there staring at the empty blood bag beside me. The nurse thanking me, her voice soft but distant, like I was underwater and everything around me had slowed down. And I remember nodding even though my head felt heavy, like I had given more than just blood, like something invisible had shifted inside me, something I could not explain. And when I stood up, my legs wobbled just slightly, enough to remind me I was still human, still fragile, still just a delivery girl who had made a choice she did not fully understand. And I thought that was the end of it, that I could walk out, go back to my scooter, finish my shift, Pretend this night would fade into something I could forget. But then I heard it, a voice behind me, low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be obeyed, asking one simple question. Where is he? And everything in the hallway changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Nurses straightened. Security stepped aside without being asked. And I turned before I could stop myself. My eyes landing on a man who did not belong in a place like this, and yet somehow owned it. Tall, composed, dressed in a dark coat that looked untouched by the rain. His presence pulling the air tight around him like gravity had shifted, and for a second I forgot to breathe because it was not just how he looked. It was how everyone else reacted to him, like he was not someone you questioned, like he was someone you made room for. And his eyes moved quickly, scanning, calculating, until they landed on me. And in that moment I felt seen in a way that made my chest tighten, not like earlier, not like when I had found the stranger in the alley. This was different. This was deliberate. And I looked away first, because something in me knew I should not hold that gaze, not with someone like him, not with someone who carried that kind of quiet authority. And a doctor rushed forward, speaking fast, explaining the situation, explaining that they had stabilized him, that the blood had come in time. And I saw the smallest shift in the man's expression, not relief, not exactly, but something that loosened just enough to tell me it mattered. And then his attention snapped back to me, sharper now, focused, and he took a step closer, not rushed, not aggressive, just inevitable. Like there was no version of this moment where he did not end up standing in front of me. And I felt my heartbeat pick up, louder, faster, like my body understood something my mind had not caught up to yet. And he stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the detail in his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but it carried something that made it impossible to ignore. You, he said, as if confirming something he already knew. And I swallowed, my throat dry, unsure why this suddenly felt more intense than anything that had happened in the last hour. You are the one who gave blood. It was not a question, and I nodded before I could think, my voice coming out softer than I intended. Yes. And for a second he just looked at me, not speaking, not moving, like he was memorizing something, like he was placing me somewhere in a mental map I did not know existed. And then he said something that did not sound like gratitude, did not sound like relief, but landed heavier than both. You should not have done that. And I blinked, caught off guard, because that was not what I expected, not after everything, not after saving a life. And I almost laughed, almost asked what kind of response that was, but the words stayed in my chest because something in his tone told me this was not a conversation I controlled. And before I could respond, a nurse called his attention, pulling him away. And just like that, the moment broke, the pressure in the air easing as he turned and walked down the hall. People parting again, silence following him like a shadow. And I stood there, still, my heart not quite steady, my mind replaying his words over and over. You should not have done that. And I told myself it did not matter. That he was just a stranger, that whatever world he came from had nothing to do with me, that I could leave right now and none of this would follow me home. But as I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt it, that same quiet shift again, like something unseen had already begun moving around me, like a decision had been made somewhere I could not hear. And for the first time since this started, I realized something I should have understood earlier. Saving him had not ended the story. It had just pulled me into it. By the time I got back on my scooter, the rain had softened into a thin mist, the kind that clung to your skin without you noticing. And the city looked different, quieter somehow, like it was holding on to something I could not see. And I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just tired, that giving blood had left me lightheaded and overthinking everything. So I adjusted my helmet, checked my phone, and forced myself back into routine. One more delivery, one more address, one more normal moment to prove that my life had not just shifted in some invisible way, but the normal I was reaching for felt just out of reach, like trying to grab smoke. And even as I drove through familiar streets, past the same neon signs and late-night diners, I could not shake the feeling that something was off, not around me, but behind me, like a quiet presence that stayed just outside my line of sight. And I caught myself checking my mirrors more than usual, glancing over my shoulder at red lights, telling myself it was nothing, that the city was always full of people, always full of movement, always full of strangers who did not care about me. But that thought did not settle the way it usually did, because tonight I had stepped into something that cared enough to notice me, and that difference sat heavy in my chest. The rest of my shift passed in a blur, automatic, hands moving, words repeating, smiles that did not quite reach my eyes, until finally I was done, my body aching as I pulled up outside my apartment building. The same cracked concrete steps, the same flickering hallway light that buzzed like it was struggling to stay alive. Everything exactly as it had always been. And for a moment I felt relief, real relief, because this was my world, small, predictable, safe in its own worn-down way. I climbed the stairs slowly, keys in hand, already thinking about a hot shower and maybe 3 hours of sleep before morning. But when I reached my door, I stopped, not because anything was wrong, but because something felt wrong, the air just slightly different, the silence a little too still, and I stood there longer than I should have, listening, waiting for a reason to explain the feeling, but nothing came, so I shook my head, told myself I was being paranoid, and unlocked the door, stepping inside. Flipping on the light, everything looked the same. My small couch, the stack of unopened bills on the table, my jacket thrown over the chair from earlier that morning, ordinary, unchanged, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, kicking off my shoes, moving toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water, trying to settle back into myself. But then I noticed it, something small, something I would have missed on any other night, an envelope sitting neatly in the center of my table, white, unmarked, not there before, and my stomach tightened instantly, because I knew I had not left anything like that. I knew my place well enough to recognize when something had been added, and for a second I just stared at it, my heartbeat picking up again, louder now, more urgent, because this was not coincidence, this was not random, this was deliberate, and slowly, carefully, I stepped closer, my fingers hovering over the envelope before I finally picked it up, the paper smooth, expensive, out of place in my small apartment, and I hesitated, just for a second, before opening it, sliding out a single card, thick, black, with a name embossed in silver that seemed to catch the light even in my dim kitchen. Adrian Volkov. The letters sharp, precise, unmistakable, and beneath it, a single line written in clean, controlled handwriting. You should not have done that. And my breath caught, because I knew that voice. I knew those words, and suddenly the quiet feeling that had followed me all night snapped into something clear, something real, something I could no longer ignore. He knew where I lived. And as I stood there holding that card, the city outside my window humming like nothing had changed, I realized with a clarity that sent a chill down my spine. I was not being followed. I had already been found. For a long moment I could not move, the card still in my hand, my eyes locked on the clean silver letters like they might rearrange themselves into something less real, something less dangerous. But they did not. They stayed exactly the same, sharp and certain, and my heartbeat climbed higher, louder, until it felt like it was echoing in the quiet of my apartment. And I realized I was standing in the middle of a room that no longer felt entirely mine, because someone else had been here, someone who moved without being noticed, someone who knew how to enter and leave without a trace except for this one deliberate message. And that thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the damp air still clinging to my clothes. I turned slowly, scanning the space again, every shadow suddenly suspicious, every corner holding more weight than it should, but nothing was disturbed, nothing was broken, everything looked untouched, and that somehow made it worse, because it meant whoever had done this did not need to force anything. They had simply decided to be here, and that kind of control was not something I understood, not something that belonged in my small, ordinary life, and I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe, to think, to stay grounded, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone followed me from the hospital. Maybe it was just a message, just a way of saying thank you in a way I did not expect. But even as I tried to convince myself, the words on the card echoed again. You should not have done that. Not thank you, not gratitude. Something else, something heavier, something that felt less like appreciation and more like a warning. And I set the card down on the table carefully, like it might burn me if I held it too long. Pacing once across the room, then back again, my mind racing through options I did not like. I could call the police, But what would I say? That a man I helped at the hospital somehow found my address and left. A business card, that nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, just a feeling that something was wrong. They would not take that seriously, and even if they did, something in me resisted. The idea, like involving anyone else, would only make things more complicated, more visible, and visibility suddenly felt dangerous. So I reached for my phone instead, staring at the screen, considering whether I should call the number printed beneath his name, my thumb hovering, hesitating, because calling meant stepping further into whatever this was, acknowledging it, accepting that this was not over. And part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend none of this had happened, to go to sleep and wake up to a version of my life where strangers did not leave messages in my apartment. But I knew better, because ignoring something like this did not make it disappear. It only meant I would not see it coming. And that thought settled something inside me, a quiet decision forming without fully asking for permission. So I picked up the card again, my fingers steadier now, memorizing the number even though I could already feel it imprinting itself somewhere deeper, and then I placed it back, down, stepping away from the table, because I was not ready to call, not yet, not like this, not while my thoughts were still scattered and my pulse still uneven. Instead, I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out at the street below, the city moving like it always did, cars passing, people walking, distant sirens blending into the background. Everything normal, everything unchanged. And yet I could not shake the feeling that something in that scene was connected to me now in a way it had not been before, like invisible lines had been drawn between me and a world I had never touched until tonight. And as I stood there watching, trying to find something familiar to hold on to, I caught it. A black car parked across the street, engine running, lights off, still in a way that did not match the flow around it. And my breath slowed, my eyes narrowing slightly as I focused, because maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just someone waiting, but then the car's window shifted just enough to reflect the streetlight differently, just enough to reveal that someone inside was watching, not the building, not the street, but me. And in that moment, the last piece fell into place. This was not a message left behind. This was a presence that had not left at all. And I realized with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my chest, whatever I had stepped into at that hospital was not waiting for me to respond. It had already decided I was part of it. I did not step away from the window right away. I could not, my fingers still gripping the edge of the curtain as I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the car across the street was just another car, that the person inside had nothing to do with me. But the longer I looked, the harder it became to believe that, because everything about it felt deliberate, the stillness, the way it did not pull out or shift like the others, the way it stayed exactly where it was, as if waiting for something or someone, and my chest tightened as a slow, steady realization settled in. This was not coincidence. This was intention, and I became suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing there in the light, visible, predictable, easy to find. So I let the curtain fall back into place, stepping away from the window with measured movements, forcing myself not to rush, not to panic, because panic would not help me think. And thinking was the only thing I had right now. I needed to understand what this meant, what he wanted, why this was happening, and more importantly, what I was supposed to do next. I paced once across the room again, slower this time, more controlled, my eyes landing back on the card sitting on the table, Adrian Volkov. The name felt heavier now, no longer just a stranger from a hospital hallway, but something connected to the presence outside, something that reached into my life without asking permission, and I realized something I had not fully accepted before. This was not about gratitude. This was about control, about awareness, about making sure I understood that I had been seen and could be reached whenever he decided. And that thought should have made me angry, should have made me push back. But instead it made me careful, because whatever world he came from, it was not one you challenged without knowing the rules, and I did not know any of them. Not yet. So I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over the keypad, this time not hesitating. As long, because ignoring this was no longer an option, not when he had already shown me that distance did not matter, that doors and walls meant nothing to him. And if there was going to be any kind of control in this situation, even a small piece, it had to start with me choosing when to respond, not waiting for him to decide everything. So I dialed the number slowly, each digit deliberate. each second stretching just a little longer as the line began to ring. Once, twice, and for a brief moment I wondered if he would not answer, if this was just another way of unsettling me. But then the line clicked, and that same voice from the hospital came through, calm, steady, like he had been expecting this call all along. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said, and something in my chest tightened again. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize you are already part of a conversation you did not start. I swallowed, steadying my voice before I spoke. "You were in my apartment," I said, keeping it simple, keeping it direct, because anything else felt like giving him more than he needed. There was a pause on the other end, not long, just enough to register, and then he replied, "Yes." No apology, no explanation, just confirmation, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I closed my eyes for a second, grounding myself, because that answer told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with. "You cannot do that," I said, and I heard it, the slight shift in my own tone. Not strong, not weak, just honest, and for the first time there was something different in his silence, something almost curious. Before he spoke again, quieter now, but more focused. "I can do many things," he said. "The question is not what I can do, Emily. It is what you should have done." Hearing my name from his mouth made something in my chest drop. A reminder that this was already deeper than I wanted it to be, and I stepped closer to the table, my free hand resting against it for balance. "I helped you," I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt. "That is what I did." And for a moment there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the line. And then he said something that settled into me in a way I could not ignore. "You gave me your blood," he said, each word precise, measured. "That is not something that stays small." And my breath slowed, my grip tightening slightly around the phone. Because in that moment I understood, this was not about the act itself, it was about what it meant to him, about what it changed, and before I could respond, before I could ask what that meant, he added one more line. Softer now, but heavier than anything else he had said. "Look outside again." And the call ended, leaving me standing there in the quiet of my apartment, the phone still in my hand, my pulse quickening as I turned slowly back toward the window, already knowing that whatever I was about to see would not make this simpler, only clearer. I did not move right away after the call ended, my hand still holding the phone against my ear like the silence might explain something if I waited long enough. But it did not. It only pressed in around me, thick and heavy, and his last words echoed again. "Look outside again." Simple, controlled, like a command he knew I would follow whether I wanted to or not. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else he had said, because it meant he understood me already, understood how I would react, how I would think. And that kind of certainty did not come from guessing. It came from knowing. Slowly, I lowered the phone, my fingers tightening around it as I turned toward the window, each step measured, deliberate, like I could somehow delay whatever I was about to see. But the closer I got, the stronger that quiet pull became, the sense that something had already changed and I was just catching up to it. I reached for the curtain again, hesitating for the smallest second before pulling it back just enough to look, and the street was still there, the same dim lights, the same passing cars, the same distant hum of the city that never really slept. But the black car was no longer across the street. My breath paused, my eyes scanning the space where it had been, empty now, gone so completely, it almost felt like I had imagined it. But I knew I had not. I knew what I had seen, and that absence did not bring relief. It brought something sharper, because if it was not there anymore, then it had moved, and I did not have to wonder long about where. A soft sound behind me made my entire body still, not loud, not dramatic, just the faintest shift of air, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is quiet. And my heart jumped, a sudden, hard beat that echoed in my chest as I turned slowly, every instinct telling me to run, to get out, to do anything but face what I already felt standing there. But I did not run, because somewhere beneath the fear was something steadier, something that refused to give him that kind of control. So I turned, fully this time, my gaze landing on the figure standing just inside my apartment like he had always belonged there. Adrian Volkov looked exactly the same as he had in the hospital, composed, precise, untouched by the world around him. His dark coat still perfect, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was not concerned about being here. not concerned about being seen. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, filled with everything I did not understand and everything he clearly did, and I forced myself to breathe, to stay present, to not let the moment overwhelm me. "You should not be here," I said finally, my voice steady enough to surprise me, and his eyes met mine, that same focused intensity, but now closer, more personal, like he was measuring not just my words but my reaction, my posture, the way I held myself. And he took one step forward, not fast, not threatening, just enough to shift the space between us. "And yet," he said quietly, "you opened the door." The words landed with a weight I was not prepared for, not because they were wrong, but because they were true in a way I had not considered. I had let this happen, not directly, not intentionally, but by stepping into his world at all, and I felt that realization settle in my chest, heavy and undeniable. "I helped you," I said again, holding on to that one fact like it might anchor me. "That does not give you the right to follow me, to come into my home." And for the first time there was a slight shift in his expression, not anger, not offense, something quieter, something more thoughtful, and he tilted his head just slightly, as if considering how to respond in a way that mattered. "You think this is about following you," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. "It is not." And I frowned, confusion cutting through the tension, because if it was not about that, then what was it about? What was the point of all of this? And he took another step closer, stopping just far enough that I could still feel the space between us, but close enough that his presence filled it completely. "You changed something," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "the moment you chose not to walk away." And my breath slowed, my focus narrowing on his words, because this was different from before, different from the warning tone. This felt like an explanation, or at least the closest thing he would offer. "People like you," he continued, "do not usually cross into lives like mine." And there it was again, that separation, that line I had not seen but had clearly crossed, and I felt it then, fully, the weight of what that meant, that this was not just about him, not just about one moment in a hospital. This was about two worlds that were never meant to touch, and yet had. And as I stood there facing him, my apartment suddenly feeling smaller, quieter, more fragile than it ever had before, I realized something that settled deep and steady inside me. I had not just saved his life, I had stepped into it, and there was no version of this where I could step back out the same. For a moment neither of us moved. The air between us stretched thin with something I could not name, something that felt too heavy for the size of my apartment, and I realized I was holding my breath again, waiting for him to say something that would make this make sense. But he did not rush. He did not fill the silence the way most people would. He let it sit there, controlled, deliberate, like even the quiet belonged to him. And that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he was comfortable here, in my space, in my world, like it did not challenge him at all. And I forced myself to break it, to reclaim even a small piece of control. "You said I changed something," I said, my voice steadier now, grounded by the need to understand. "What does that even mean?" And his gaze did not leave mine, not for a second, like he had been waiting for that question, like this was the part that mattered. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more precise. "It means," he said slowly, "you made a choice most people would not survive making." And my brow tightened slightly, confusion mixing with something sharper, because I was still trying to fit his words into something logical, something I could grasp. "I saw someone who needed help," I replied. That is all that was. And for the first time there was something almost like a shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth, not warm, not mocking, just aware, like he knew something I did not. "That is what you think," he said, and then he stepped closer again, just enough that I could feel the shift in the space between us, not touching, not crossing that line, but close enough that I could not ignore his presence. "But people do not end up like me by accident," he continued, "and they do not stay alive by trusting strangers." And there was something in the way he said that, something quiet but certain, that made my chest tighten again, because it hinted at a world where trust was rare, where survival came with rules I had never learned. And suddenly the moment in the alley replayed in my mind, the way he had been there, alone, the way something about it had felt wrong even before I understood why, and a thought slipped in, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. Maybe helping him had not just been unexpected. Maybe it had been dangerous. So what? I said, my voice softer now, more careful. I should have walked away. And his eyes held mine for a long second, steady, searching, like he was measuring the weight of that question. And when he answered, there was no hesitation. Yes, he said. Simple, direct, and the word landed harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to think about, that the world he came from did not reward kindness the way mine tried to. And I felt that difference settle between us, clear and undeniable. But you did not, he added, and his tone shifted again, not softer, but more focused, like this was the part he cared about. And that matters. And I shook my head slightly, a small, instinctive reaction, because I still did not understand why it mattered this much, why it had followed me home, why it had brought him here. It should not, I said, almost to myself. But he heard it. Of course he did. And something in his expression sharpened just slightly. It does, he replied. Because now you are not invisible anymore. And my stomach tightened at that. Because invisibility had always been my safety. Blending in, going unnoticed, living quietly enough that the world passed me by without asking anything in return. And hearing that I had lost that without even realizing it made something inside me shift. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, deeper and sharper than before. What does that mean for me? I asked, and this time my voice was different, not defensive, not uncertain, just direct, because if I was already part of this, I needed to understand what that meant, and he studied me for a moment, longer than before, like this answer required more than just words, like it was something that would define what came next. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but it carried more weight than anything he had said so far. It means, he said, you do not get to pretend this never happened. And I felt that settle in, solid and unavoidable, because I knew he was right, even if I did not want him to be. And then he added, just as calm, just as certain, and it means you do not face it alone. And something in my chest caught on that. Not comfort, not exactly, but something close enough to make me pause. Because for the first time since this started, his presence did not feel like a threat I needed to escape. It felt like something I needed to understand, and that realization was more dangerous than anything else, because it meant part of me was already adjusting to a world I had never planned to enter. His words did not leave the room when he said them. They stayed, settled into the walls, into the space between us, into me, and I felt it, that shift again, deeper this time. Not just awareness, but something heavier, something that felt like the ground beneath my life had quietly tilted without asking for permission, and I did not know if I should push back against it or try to steady myself on it. So I did the only thing I could. I focused on what I could still control, my voice, my stance. The way I looked at him without stepping back. I did not ask for that, I said, and the words were simple, but they carried everything I was trying to hold on to, everything that still belonged to me. And he watched me closely, that same calculating calm, like he was measuring whether I believed what I was saying or just needed to say it. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. No, he said, you did not. And there was something unexpected in that, something that did not dismiss me, did not override me, just accepted the truth of it without changing anything. And that somehow made it more real, not less, because it meant this was not something I could argue my way out of, not something I could explain away. It simply existed now, and I was standing inside it. Then why are you here? I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice. Because if he was going to pull me into this, then I needed answers, real ones, not just statements that left more questions behind. And he did not look away, did not deflect. He stepped slightly to the side instead, his gaze moving briefly toward the window, toward the city beyond it, like what he was about to say connected to something larger than just this room. Because the moment you helped me, he said, you became visible to people who do not ignore things like that. And my chest tightened again, not from fear, but from the clarity of it, because I understood what he meant. Without him needing to explain further, I had stepped into something I did not see, something that did not forget, something that paid attention in ways I was not used to. And you think being here fixes that? I said, a slight edge creeping into my voice now, because part of me resisted the idea that he was the solution to a problem he had not warned me about in the first place. And this time, there was the faintest shift in his expression again, something sharper, something more defined. "It does not fix it," he replied. "It contains it." And the words settled differently, more controlled, more intentional, like he was not offering safety, but structure, not removing the danger, but managing it. And I exhaled slowly, absorbing that, because it was not comforting, not in the way I would have wanted, but it was honest, and honesty felt more useful right now than anything else. "So what?" I said, my voice quieter now, more focused. "You just stay here, watch me, decide what happens next." And for the first time, there was something almost like a pause in him, not uncertainty, but consideration, like he was choosing his next words carefully, not because he had to, but because he wanted them to land exactly where they should. "No," he said finally. "I do not decide everything." And I felt my brow tighten slightly at that, because it did not match what I had seen so far. The control, the certainty, the way he moved through my life like it was already mapped out. And he seemed to catch that, because his next words came softer, but more deliberate. "But I decide what I protect." And there it was again, that word, protect, the same one he had implied before, the same one that did not sit easily with me, because protection from someone like him did not come without weight, did not come without expectation, and I felt that tension settle between us, unspoken but clear. "And you think that is me?" I said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, just something that needed to be said out loud. And he stepped closer again, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to make sure I could not ignore the answer. "You are not something I think about," he said, his voice low, steady. "You are something I know about." And my breath caught slightly at that, because it was not possessive in the way I had expected. It was more certain than that, more grounded, like a fact he had already accepted. And he held my gaze for one more second before adding, quieter now, but heavier than anything else he had said, "You gave me your blood, Emily." And there it was again, that connection, that line I could not undo. And I felt it then, fully, not just as an idea, but as something real, something that tied this moment to the one in that hospital room, something that made this feel less like coincidence and more like consequence. And as I stood there, my apartment no longer just mine, my life no longer just mine, I realized something that settled deep and steady inside me. This was not about whether I wanted him here or not. This was about what I had already set in motion, and whether I was ready to understand what it would take to live with it. The room felt smaller after he said that, like the walls had moved in just enough to remind me that space was no longer something I could take for granted, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, letting his words settle into something I could actually hold on to, something that made sense. But the truth was it did not fit into anything I knew. It did not align with the way my life had worked up until now. And that disconnect created something sharper inside me, something that pushed back instead of pulling away. "You keep saying that like it means something permanent," I said, my voice steady but quieter now, more focused, because I was starting to understand that volume did not matter with him. Only clarity did, and his eyes did not shift, not even slightly, as if he had expected that response, as if he had already considered every angle I might take before I even spoke. "It is permanent," he replied, not forceful, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty was what made it land, not the words themselves, but the way he carried them, like they were not up for negotiation. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but resistance, because permanence was not something I gave easily, not to anything, not to anyone. "You do not get to decide that," I said, and there it was again, that small reclaiming of ground, that need to remind both of us that I still existed inside this situation, that I was not just something he could define without question. And for a moment, just a moment, there was silence again, but this time it felt different, less heavy, more deliberate, like a pause instead of a wait. And he looked at me in a way that shifted something I could not quite name, not softer, not less intense, but more aware, like he was seeing not just what I had done, but who I was choosing to be in this moment. "You are right," he said, and the words caught me off guard, enough that I blinked, because agreement was not something I expected from him, not in this way, not here, And he continued before I could respond. I do not decide everything. And there it was again, that distinction he had made before, that line between control and choice, and I felt it settled differently this time. Less like something imposed, more like something being offered, even if I was not sure what it cost. But I do decide what I do with what is mine. He added, and the word mine landed heavier than before, not louder, not sharper, just deeper, like it had been there the entire time, and I was only now starting to understand the weight of it, and my breath slowed, my thoughts aligning just enough to recognize the shift, because this was not just about protection anymore. This was about something more defined, something more intentional, and I felt the tension return, but different now, less chaotic, more focused. I am not something you get to claim, I said, and this time there was no hesitation at all, because that line mattered more than anything else he had said so far. And for a second, just a second, the air between us held still again, and I watched him closely, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the pushback, the dismissal, the assertion of control I had come to expect, but it did not come the way I thought it would. Instead, he studied me, not dismissing, not overriding, just observing, like he was recalibrating something in his mind. And then he took a small step back, not retreating, but adjusting, and that single movement shifted everything, because it meant he had heard me, actually heard me, and that mattered more than I wanted it to. No, he said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying that same certainty. You are not something I claim. And my chest eased just slightly at that. Not fully, not enough to trust it, but enough to notice. And then he added, just as calm, just as deliberate. You are something I keep safe. And there it was again, that word, but now it felt different, not imposed, not forced, but placed carefully, like he understood it was not something I would accept easily. And I looked at him for a long second, searching for something in his expression that would tell me what that really meant, what it would cost, what it would take from me. But all I saw was that same controlled focus, that same unwavering presence. And I realized something then, something that settled in quietly but firmly. This was not a situation where I could win by pushing back harder or stepping away faster. This was something that required understanding, something that demanded I see it clearly before I decided what to do with it. And as I stood there, the distance between us no longer just physical, but something more defined, I felt the shift fully take hold, not just in him, but in me. Because for the first time since this started, I was not just reacting to what was happening, I was choosing how to stand in it. And that choice, small as it was, felt like the only thing that still truly belonged to me. Something shifted the moment he stepped back, not in the room, not in him, but in me, like a line had been drawn that I could finally see. And for the first time since this started, I was not just reacting, I was thinking, really thinking about what this meant, about what came next, and more importantly, about what I was willing to accept, because whatever this was, it was not temporary. It was not something that would fade by morning or disappear if I ignored it long enough. It was here, standing in front of me, looking at me like I was already part of something bigger than I understood, and I realized I had a choice, not about whether this existed, but about how I faced it. So I straightened slightly, grounding myself in that thought, in that small piece of control that still belonged to me. If you are going to stay involved in my life, I said, my voice calm but firm, then I need to know exactly what that means. And he watched me closely, that same steady focus. But there was something else there now, something quieter, almost like approval, not for what I was asking, but for the fact that I was asking at all. And he nodded once, a small, deliberate movement. It means you will not be left unprotected, he said, and I exhaled slowly, because that word, again, protect, still did not sit easily with me. But I let him continue. It means I will know where you are, when you are at risk, when something changes. And there it was, the part that tightened my chest again, not fear, but awareness, because that was not just protection, that was presence, constant, controlled, something that reached into my life whether I invited it or not. And I held his gaze, not stepping back, not softening. That is not protection, I said quietly. That is control. And for a second, just a second, the air shifted again, not tense, not sharp, but precise, like we had both stepped into something more defined, and he did not deny it, did not correct me, did not even hesitate. They are not always different, he replied. And the honesty of that landed harder than anything else he could have said, because it meant he was not trying to convince me, not trying to make this sound better than it was. He was telling me exactly what I was dealing with, and I respected that more than I wanted to admit, even if I did not like it. And what do I get to decide? I asked, and this time my voice was steady in a different way, not defensive, not uncertain, but clear, because if I was going to stand in this, I needed to understand where I stood, and he held my gaze for a long moment before answering. Like this question mattered more than the others. Like this was the part that defined everything else. You decide how close I am, he said, and something in me stilled at that, because it was not what I expected, not control, not distance forced on me, but a line I could draw, even if he was the one standing near it. And I felt that settle in slowly, carefully, like something fragile I was not ready to trust yet. And if I say I want you out of my life completely? I asked, testing it, needing to hear the answer out loud. And there was that pause again, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was weighing something that did not come easily. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. Then I stay far enough that you do not see me, he said, but not far enough that I cannot reach you. And my breath slowed, because that answer told me everything I needed to know. This was not something I could end, not completely, not anymore, but it was something I could shape, something I could define within limits I was only starting to understand. And I nodded once, more to myself than to him, because that was the first real piece of ground I had been given, and I needed to hold on to it. Then this is how it works, I said, my voice steady, grounded in the decision I was making. You do not come into my home without permission, you do not follow me where I can see you, and you do not make decisions for me. And I watched him closely as I spoke, measuring his reaction the way he had measured mine. And for a second, just a second, something shifted in his expression again, something sharper, more defined, like he was reassessing not the situation, but me. And then he nodded, once, slow and deliberate. Agreed, he said, and the word landed with more weight than I expected, because it meant he accepted the terms, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice mattered, more than I could explain. And as the silence settled between us again, different now, less uncertain, more structured, I realized something that changed everything in a quieter way. This was no longer something happening to me. This was something I was now part of shaping, and that made it more dangerous, but it also made it mine. The word agreed did not echo the way his other words had. It did not settle heavily into the room or press against my chest. It landed quietly, almost calmly, but that was what made it different, what made it matter. Because it was not forced, it was chosen, and I realized that choice carried its own kind of weight, one I had to take seriously whether I wanted to or not. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt structured, like boundaries had been drawn even if I could not see them yet. And I became aware of my own breathing, slower now, steadier, like my body was adjusting to something my mind was still trying to catch up to. And I looked at him, really, looked at him, not just as the man who had appeared in my apartment uninvited, not just as the stranger I had helped hours ago, but as someone who moved through the world with a kind of certainty I had never experienced, someone who did not ask for space but understood how to exist within it anyway. And that realization brought something unexpected with it, not comfort, not trust, but clarity, the kind that makes everything sharper instead of easier. Then you leave, I said finally, because that was the next step, the only step that made sense if what we had just agreed to actually meant anything. And for a second, just a second, I wondered if he would challenge that, if he would stay, if he would remind me in some quiet way that he could, but he did not. Instead, he studied me for a moment longer, like he was confirming something, like he was deciding whether this version of me matched whatever expectation he had already formed. And then he nodded once, that same slow, deliberate motion. For tonight, he said, and the addition did not go unnoticed, but I let it sit there, because pushing against every word would only blur the lines I had just worked to define. And he turned slightly, his movement smooth, controlled, like every step he took had already been considered before it happened. And I watched him as he moved toward the door, my door, the same one I had unlocked hours ago without thinking. And now it felt different, heavier, like it marked something more than just the entrance to my apartment. and he stopped just before reaching it, his hand resting lightly on the handle, not opening it yet, not leaving just yet. And for a moment I thought he might say something else, something that would pull this back into uncertainty. But when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured. "You will go to work tomorrow," he said, not a question, not a command, just a statement, and I nodded slightly, because of course I would. My life did not pause just because something unexpected had entered it. I still had responsibilities, bills, routines that grounded me, and he watched that reaction. That confirmation, like it mattered more than the answer itself. "Good," he said, and there was something in that word, something that felt less like approval and more like calculation, like he was placing that detail somewhere in a larger picture I could not see yet. And then he added, just as calmly, "Stay where there are people." And my brow tightened slightly at that, not because I did not understand it, but because I did, because it was not advice. It was a quiet adjustment to the reality he had already described, that I was no longer invisible, that my presence carried weight in ways I had not considered before, and I felt that settle in again, not overwhelming, not consuming, but constant, like a background shift I would have to learn to live with. And he opened the door then, the sound soft but final, and for a second the outside hallway light spilled into my apartment, cutting a thin line across the floor, and he stepped through it without hesitation, without looking back immediately, like leaving was just another controlled action, another piece of a sequence he had already decided. But just before the door closed, he paused, turning his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine one last time, and there was something different in it now, not softer, not less intense, but more defined, like whatever he had come here to confirm had been answered. "Emily," he said, my name steady in his voice. "This only works if you tell me when something feels wrong." And I held his gaze, processing that, because it was not a demand, not an order, it was something else, something closer to a condition, and I nodded once, not because I fully understood it yet, but because I recognized that it mattered. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that echoed more than any of his words had, and I stood there in the stillness that followed, my apartment returning to something that looked the same but felt entirely different. And I realized something as I exhaled slowly, something that settled deep and steady inside me. He had left, but nothing about this was over, not even close, because whatever we had just agreed to was not an ending. It was the beginning of something I had only just started to understand. Sleep did not come easily after he left, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not slow down. Every word he had said replaying in different ways, every pause, every look, every choice I had made, and every one I had not realized I was making at the time. And I lay there staring at the ceiling in the dim light of my apartment, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, trying to convince myself that tomorrow would feel normal again, that I would wake up, and this would all settle into something manageable, something that fit into the life I had before. But even as I thought it, I knew it was not true, because something had already shifted, something that did not reverse overnight. And when my alarm finally went off, the sound cutting sharply through the silence, I sat up slower than usual, my body heavy, my thoughts already moving before I could catch up to them. I got ready the way I always did, routine grounding me in small ways, brushing my hair, pulling on my jacket, grabbing my keys. But everything felt slightly different, like I was moving through the same actions with a new awareness layered over them. And when I stepped outside, the air felt sharper, cooler against my skin, the morning light softer than it should have been, and I paused for just a second at the top of the stairs, scanning the street without thinking, not searching for anything specific, just noticing. And that was when I realized it. The difference was not in what I saw, it was in how I saw it. Every car, every person, every movement carried a weight it had not carried before, like I was finally aware of how much I had never paid attention to. And I exhaled slowly, adjusting to that, not resisting it, because resisting it would not change anything. And I made my way down to my scooter, starting it with familiar ease, letting the sound settle something steady inside me. And I told myself this was still my life, still my routine, still something I could move through on my own terms. But as I pulled into traffic, merging into the flow of the city, I felt it again, that quiet presence, not visible, not obvious, but there, somewhere just beyond what I could see. And this time I did not panic. I did not check my mirrors every few seconds. I did not try to confirm it. Because I already understood it. He had said it himself, not far enough that I cannot reach you. And that knowledge sat with me differently now, not as fear, but as something I had to account for, something I had to learn to navigate. And I focused on the road ahead, on the rhythm of the ride, on the steady movement of the city around me, letting it pull me back into something familiar, until I reached my first delivery of the day, a small cafe tucked between two office buildings, the smell of coffee drifting out as I stepped inside, warm and grounding. And for a moment, just a moment, everything felt normal again, the kind of normal I could understand, people talking, machines humming, the simple exchange of orders and payments, and I held on to that, letting it anchor me as I moved through the morning, one delivery after another, one street after the next, until something shifted again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough that I felt it before I saw it, a change in the way people moved around me, a slight hesitation, a glance that lingered just a second longer than it should have, and I slowed slightly, my eyes scanning the area without making it obvious, and that was when I noticed him, not Adrian, not directly, but one of his men, standing across the street, dressed like anyone else, blending in perfectly except for the way he held himself, still, aware, watching, not intrusive, not obvious, but present in a way that confirmed everything I had been trying to understand, and my breath steadied as I looked away, not acknowledging it, not reacting, because I understood now. This was what it meant, not control in the way I had feared, not constant interference, but a presence that existed whether I chose to see it or not. And I felt that realization settle in fully, not overwhelming, not suffocating, just constant, like a new layer of my life I had to learn to move with. And as I continued down the street, the city unfolding around me like it always had, I realized something that grounded me in a way nothing else had so far. I was still moving forward, still choosing each step, even if the world around me had quietly changed. By the time the sun dipped lower and the city shifted into that in-between hour where everything softened but never truly slowed, I realized I had stopped looking for him and started accounting for him instead, and that difference mattered more than I expected, because it meant something had settled inside me without asking permission, something quiet but steady, and I did not know if that was strength or surrender, maybe a little of both. My last delivery took me farther out than usual, a quieter street lined with older buildings, the kind that held on to the past in small details, chipped paint, narrow stairways, windows that reflected more sky than light. And as I parked my scooter and removed my helmet, I felt it again, that same subtle awareness, not sharp, not alarming, just present, like a second rhythm moving alongside my own. And I did not turn to find it. I did not search for confirmation, because I already understood what I would see, or more accurately, what I would not see. And I walked up the steps, completed the delivery, exchanged a few simple words, normal, ordinary, grounding. And when I stepped back outside, the air felt cooler, the street quieter, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the stillness settle around me, letting the day catch up to me in a way it had not allowed itself to until now. And that was when I heard it, my phone vibrating softly in my pocket, a sound that felt louder than it should have, more deliberate, and I knew, before I even reached for it, who it would be, not because I had memorized the number, but because I understood the pattern now, the timing, the way he moved just outside of visibility, but never out of reach. I pulled the phone out, the screen lighting up with a single message, no name. No introduction, just words. Did anything feel wrong today? And I stared at it for a second, longer than necessary, because the question was simple, but the answer was not entirely. Nothing had happened in the way I would have defined wrong before. No immediate danger, no moment that demanded action, and yet everything had felt different. Every step, every glance, every quiet shift in the world around me. And I realized that was the point, not to eliminate what could go wrong, but to make sure I noticed it before it did. And I exhaled slowly, my fingers hovering over the screen before I typed back. No, nothing I could not handle. And I watched the message send, the small movement feeling more significant than it should have, because it was not just a response, it was acknowledgement, it was participation. It was me stepping further into something I had not fully chosen but was no longer avoiding. And the reply came faster than I expected, one simple line. Good. And I felt something settle at that. Not relief, not comfort, but a kind of alignment, like two separate realities had found a way to exist alongside each other without colliding, at least for now. And I slipped my phone back into my pocket, looking out at the street again, the quiet, the fading light, the movement that continued whether I paid attention to it or not. And I realized something then. Something that did not come all at once but unfolded slowly, piece by piece. I had not lost my life. I had not been pulled out of it or replaced. I was still here, still moving, still choosing. But now there was something else layered over it, something darker, more controlled, more aware, and instead of breaking me, it had sharpened something inside me I had not known was there. And as I put my helmet back on and started my scooter, the engine humming beneath me, I felt that shift fully settle into place, not as something to fear, but something to understand, because the truth was simple in a way. That surprised me. He could control the city. He could control what moved in the shadows, but he did not control me, not completely. And as I pulled back into the street, the lights flickering on one by one as the evening took hold, I realized the balance between those two things was where everything that mattered would happen next.